Our next question is from somebody whose voice we recognize. Debbie and I, we kind of laughed when we heard this question. It's young Caitlin, and we've had her on the show. So this is Caitlin's question about due process on January 6th. Listen.
Hi, Dinesh. I was reading the Bill of Rights the other day, and I was very shocked when I read Amendment number 5, which reads, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Of course, I immediately thought of the January 6th defendants, some of which have been locked in solitary confinement for months on end. Considering that the next amendment reads, "In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy a speedy and public trial," it seems to me that their treatment is shockingly unconstitutional. If so, why is no one talking about that? And if not, what am I missing? Thanks.
Well, Caitlin, first of all, I love your opening phrase, while reading the Bill of Rights the other day. This is so great, Caitlin. You're a great learner, and what I like about it is you're not just learning things in the abstract. Your mind immediately applies them to events going on, and you test these propositions against actual empirical experience. And no, you're not missing anything. You're actually quite right. And I would elaborate your question even further by adding a kind of Dinesh element to it. So you mentioned two things, the Due Process Clause, the Fifth Amendment, the right to a speedy trial, and then read on to the 14th Amendment, where you will discover the phrase equal rights under the law. Equal rights under the law. Now let's apply these phrases one by one. Let's start with the concept of a speedy trial, because there's no question that the January 6th defendants are not being granted anything resembling a speedy trial. Now, the term speedy trial obviously has an element of elasticity or discretion in it. A speedy trial is speedy compared to the ability of both sides, for example, to go through the discovery process and to have a sharing of the evidence available to both sides so the trial can actually be a real and comprehensive trial. But see, what happens in reality is that the government pretends like, well, we haven't built a database. We haven't really got all the evidence. We're still interviewing people. We're still conducting our investigations, and judges have been, I would say, too deferential to the government and basically saying, well, okay, in that case, let's move the trial. And it gets moved back 3 months, 6 months. In some cases, you've got defendants whose trials aren't till the middle of next year. So I think that this is taking the concept of speedy trial and twisting it beyond all recognition. So you, Caitlin, are onto something here. This is a violation of a constitutional provision. There's no meaningful interpretation of speedy that can be matched against what's happening to at least some of the January 6 defendants. Now let's talk about due process. The due process clause is, on the face of it, not being violated because the government will say, well, listen, we take these January 6 defendants. It is part of the law that if they pose a danger to the community, they're not going to be released pre-trial. So they're going to be held because they might pose a danger to the community. Now, do they in fact pose a danger to the community? No. I think in virtually all cases, they don't. But what's happening is that these judges are apparently being convinced that because they questioned the election, they stormed in the Capitol, that these are somehow dangerous seditionists who cannot be let out prior to their case, prior to their trial. And this is the rationale for holding them. It's a bogus rationale, I grant you. But they're not being denied due process in the sense that the government isn't saying, well, listen, we're not going to give you a trial. We're not going to go through any process. We're simply going to give you 3 years or 5 years. That would be a flat out denial of due process. The due process clause is about process. It's about having to go through a legal process. Now, there is a wrinkle here or a complexity I want to mention. I'm not going to discuss it, but I'll mention it, that in the history of Supreme Court jurisprudence, people have talked about and judges have talked about procedural versus substantive due process. Procedural due process means simply going through the motions or going through the procedures. Substantive due process is a way of saying the due process isn't just about procedure. It's not just about going through a process. It is about actually making sure that the legal system works in your case. So substantive due process is a way of interpreting due process in a more, you can say, thick or meaty way than a mere procedure. Now, let me turn and conclude my answer to your question by looking at the equal protection of the laws, because it seems to me here is where the Constitution kicks in big time. Because the one expectation we have, if you think about justice at its basic level, justice doesn't just mean, did you break the law? You can break the law by, let's say, jaywalking, but if somebody gives you 5 years in prison for that, that would be outrageous. Why? It'd be outrageous because you're the only guy who got that penalty. This is not a serious offense. The penalty doesn't fit the crime, and it's not being equitably applied. Everybody else who jaywalks has to pay a $50 fine or isn't even prosecuted at all. So justice, to be meaningful, goes beyond breaking the law. It also involves measuring the penalty to the offense, and it involves making sure that people in similar situations, now you can't make sure that you have identical penalties that apply, particularly when you have different juries. This is occurring in different states. There's going to be some variation. But it seems to me that when you look at what was handed out to the BLM protesters, I mean, you're talking about looters and rioters and arsonists, and you compare their plight to nonviolent January 6 protesters, you see that the January 6 defendants are being grossly deprived of equal justice under the law.